know what Google's been up to. It's just ridiculous. There we go. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our 5th foundation meeting with our special guest, Rune Christensen. We'll be spending the meeting discussing some of the finer points that were introduced in the foundation proposal doc that was released recently. If you haven't had a chance to read it, take a look at the description box below. We'll have a link there to do some research if you want to find out what's been going on in the world of Maker and how we are moving down this road towards gradual decentralization, which is one of the topics that we'll be touching on today, as well as talking about sustainable finance and how some of these initiatives will help introduce DAI to the wider ecosystem. Let's kick off some introductions. Jess, you want to tell us what you're up to and who you are?
Hey, how's it going? I'm Jessica, and I'm a community manager similar to Rich. And if you have any questions that you'd like to chat in, I'll help moderate and get those read off for you.
Cool, yeah. And as always, if anybody has a question they want to ask, don't be shy. You can either just speak up or type in chat, or feel free to interrupt. We're forgiving that way. Rune, did you want to introduce yourself and then maybe kick off the talk for us?
Hey everyone, I'm Rune, the co-founder of Maker and CEO of the Maker Foundation, and also the person responsible for interacting with the community regarding our foundation proposal, which is the proposed path forward for the foundation and the community. And that's really meant to, among other things, bootstrap and kickstart the decentralized governance of Maker and create this sort of a decentralized identity and community spirit that can turn Maker into an actual DAO in the long run.
Cool. And there's a lot to potentially go over, and in these meetings we've been doing a brief recap and touching on some previous issues, and then sort of trying to plow ahead through the document to get to the end of it. Did you want to touch on the 20% principle at all today, or do you want to save that till the end, or which section do you think we should focus on?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. The 20%. So it's very quickly became clear that the 20% period, like that, the other principles of the foundation proposal. Well, I guess primarily both the 20% principle, which is sort of the charity, means directly giving charity and using Maker as a way to improve financial equality in the world. And then also the other principle, which is sustainable finance, which is basically a principle meant to ensure that Maker becomes like the financing component of Maker is guaranteed to also become a force for good and has little chance of having any sort of like promoting negative externalities. And this was quite controversial, a bit more than I expected actually, in our still relatively small community. So this has been mostly the topics we've been focusing on, with me addressing the various arguments against charity, basically. And just like the concerns people have had, and yeah, I think we should go over it now as well, because it is basically like the main thing people care about. But we could start with something else first for a change, and then like circle back to it in the end.
Yeah, that might be an idea, because it seems like as you said, there's going to be a lot of discussion. It's a hornet's nest, and there's definitely some ethical rabbit holes that we need to discuss with the 20% principle. So sustainable finance, did you want to move on to that first, and then we can proceed?
Yeah, I mean, so sustainable finance is we also discussed that quite a bit recently. And basically the core idea is actually twofold. So first of all, it is just that accounting for negative externalities and accounting for like extreme long run effects, or rather very long run effects, I guess the better way to say it. So just like the accounting for the very long run, and basically sort of the permanent, like the idea that, you know, what is things going to look like in thousands of years, for instance, and so on. Like if you really take that very long run look, then when you do a risk assessment of an asset, it actually makes, like, typically the sort of the purely profit motive and like sort of the rational risk assessment actually does include, like, actually does give an advantage to stuff that is just better for the world typically. And there's like a number of arguments that can be made for this. And actually one very simple argument is something like, is it like regulatory crackdown basically. So something like, it's like, there's a bigger risk of like sudden stability shocks, like sudden, there's like sudden instability and sudden crashes and so on in an industry, like let's say the fossil fuel industry, because there is this like controversy and this like perceived negative externality that's not being addressed in the industry right now, that potentially at some point in the future could be cracked down on by governments for introducing new carbon taxes and whatever, all types of, there could be all this like, you know, because there's this perception of a negative effect of the fossil fuel industry, there is a risk that in the future there will be some sort of counter force, essentially, right? Like some opposite force coming in and trying to negate that, and as a result, actually damaging the financial viability of fossil fuel linked assets. So that's, I mean, and there's a number of other similar arguments. I mean, another one is also just something like an like something like fossil fuels, which have like negative externalities. They actually have like their negative impact on the world in the form of something like climate change. Something actually can be considered having a direct negative impact on other assets in the Maker collateral portfolio, right? Because you could have a financial crash as a result of climate change that then creates a black swan event and damages Maker, and that I mean, and like theoretically that could be caused by Maker giving too cheap loans to fossil fuels and then like creating a massive credit boom towards drilling for oil or something, and then that extra oil is what it takes to sort of bring everything over the edge in a sustainable way that is unable to like guard against. And then the final effect is actually a lot of stocks crash or something because there's like riots in an industrial center or whatever. I mean, this is a hypothetical scenario, but the point is like there is the negative externality of an asset can actually impact the stability of Maker as a whole, right? And like,
so that's interesting though. So I think the first place that my mind goes to is how to measure negative externalities, and there's frequently people toss around examples, and one of those is electric vehicles and battery technology, and trying to determine whether that's a net benefit against the traditional fossil fuels, and then trying to figure out the impact of everything from a heavy metal all the way to a charging station can be enormously complex. So with sustainable finance, will that be sort of a weighting mechanism that's applied to a proposed collateral type that is simply an additional data point, or is that going to be sort of a make or break decision when the risk teams come up with a potential collateral?
Yeah, I mean, so the interesting thing is that this entire facet of the sustainable finance principle is actually also encompassed in the principle of scientific governance itself, right? Because if a negative externality has a rational impact on just like the risk of an asset, then that should be included in just like the standard models, like this sort of the unbiased neutral models.
And and the way that these frameworks are designed, or the way that we evaluate potential collateral types is, I think that the phrase that you've used a few times is, unless it's an outright scam, it's probably going to get in. There's no reason to exclude something. So if something turned out to have significant negative externalities, we're going to have to come up with a better term than that. But if something was a negative, a net negative for, say, an industry or a geopolitical region, would we just simply recommend, or would the risk teams recommend a lower debt ceiling or higher stability fees, or how would that be managed?
So I mean, it's like, I guess the answer is sort of a combination of all, and I mean, going deeper into this is just going to be actually diving into what scientific governance is by itself and how that's going to work. But because it is actually in some sense in the long run, our risk models will actually not like they're more linear than you think, in the sense that like you can sort of trade stability fee for liquidation ratio and also for debt ceiling to some degree. I mean, not absolute debt ceiling, but like relative debt ceiling, in the sense of like relative exposure of the overall collateral portfolio. So it's basically just, I mean, you can just think of it as, well, I mean, yeah, like when you do a complete risk assessment of an asset, you need to take everything into account, including its very long run negative externalities, and potentially, and this is actually the key point, right? Like it's also whether we have to take into account not just what the assets we include in the collateral portfolio, sort of this like not just in the one-way sense that they have an impact on us. When we include, let's say, fossil fuels, then they have some type of, they give us some level of exposure that helps us, helps us hedge against other types of risk, but also have their own risk. And that's sort of the simplistic and sort of the one-way look of where we just like think about what do these assets do to us. But in like the sustainable finance principle to some degree is also like we need to take into account what is the impact we have on these assets, right? So when we include an oil token that represents actual oil, like bunker oil in Singapore or something, and we give it a really, like we give it a low stability fee or something, and as a result, people, they buy a lot of this oil so they can generate DAI cheaply and so on, then we actually drive up the price of oil and result in like more oil being like physically stored in that location. And then as a result, there's an increased risk of, I don't know, like an oil spill that could then somehow ruin some other asset, like some asset tied to the natural resources of Singapore or something. Or let's say a beach resort, right? We also have some stocks of a beach resort as an asset, right? And then like we actually have to, in the long run, and sort of in the extreme end of extreme endpoint of scientific governance, we have to take those types of relationships into account, and we have to basically think about if we lower the risk, like we lower the stability fee, for instance, for this asset, that means that it both means that we are now sort of insured for less, right? Because it's given a lower income that goes to us, but also we are actually benefiting that asset as well, and it's as a result perhaps creating these like knock-on effects that we also need to take into account.
So that's interesting. With sustainable finance, it's not only sort of this altruistic worldview or this larger perspective, but it's also it's economic stability, I guess, in the wider world, when we reach that sort of stage of our development, and also how it could potentially impact other collateral types inside the ecosystem.
Yeah, but an argument could actually be made that this doesn't even this is entirely already encompassed in the scientific governance principle, right? Because this is what you have to do anyway if you want to make the fully rigorous scientific governance. So the other component of the sustainable finance principle that is not a part, that has nothing to do with scientific governance, is just basically the PR, like the branding of it, right? Like that we basically want to be able to credibly and say and also feel anyone involved in the project and as maker holders and so on, right? Like we want to know that Maker is actually going to be a beneficial force in the world, right? Like it's not just about making a stable currency or a more efficient system that creates a lot of wealth or something. It's also just changing finance into something that actually safeguards the interests of the world as a whole and of everyone. And this ties very much into the 20% principle, right? And there's all those thoughts about how we need to do more than just we're not a company, basically, right? Like we need to actually be more than that.
All right, there's lots to unpack there, and that's a good start. I noticed that David has shown up, which is great. He posted a great article in Medium recently about the 20% principle, and kicked off an enormous thread of people back and forth around some of the concepts we talked about there, or you presented there, Rune. David, can you do me a favor and sort of do an audit on that thread and see if you can come up with some really interesting questions or things that people have the most concern about? And maybe towards the end of the meeting, you can present some of those back to us for discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll parse it.
Sounds great. Thanks.
Also, Jordan just asked a very relevant question. So Jordan just watched Matt's recent talk in which Matt discussed creating a basket bed over at DevCon in Berlin. And Jordan says it looks like we are developing this in-house right now, but in the long term, will MKR holders also be involved in what is included in this basket? And would it make sense for the long-term goal of this basket to be made of the same ratios of CDP collateral, since Matt did seem to indicate in his talk that the long-term goal is for no fiat to be considered in this basket?
Yeah, I mean, so this is a really interesting topic, and the thing about this universal global DAI idea for the long run is that it is actually still something that's very much like probably the longest term part of the core Maker roadmap, and that is actually because these kind of questions are not really there are not really any easy answers to these kind of questions. And what that really means is that, yeah, that actually means that it's not just going to be involving MKR holders. Ultimately, it will be entirely up to the community as a whole to basically scientifically and sort of with scientific rigor actually trying to answer some very hard questions here in terms of what is it we actually want, what is actually the best thing to do, kind of, which it's just very hard when you don't really have it's hard to it's hard to define what the goal even is, right? Because I mean, one way to look at this, to sort of analyze this question could be, if our goal is to maximize income for maximize the price of MKR or something, then what is it then we want to achieve, and then what is the basket we should choose or something. Or maybe it is our goal is to maximize stability of DAI, but then the problem is what does that even mean, right? And that could be something like maximize utility for the individuals. I mean, there's all of these different ways to approach this question. Yeah, I mean, the good news is that we basically plan to entirely outsource the actual decision making in this to the community. Or at least, I mean, that doesn't mean that I'm, for instance, and other people in the foundation are not gonna develop strong opinions here. But right now we don't have that at all. We simply, it's just all we really know is that this is a very complex, and the answer to this kind of question is sort of it's almost like developing a new solving a great problem of economics or something like that.
So we can assume that this is going to be an iterative process then, that over the course of months or potentially years, this will be hashed out through the scientific governance and the risk framework proposal process?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, this will come very late. So this will be many years before this really becomes relevant. So before we even, so sort of the very first step, right? First we have multi-collateral coming up, right? Initially, it's just going to be multi-collateral DAI that's pegged to the US dollar and is backed by many different types of collateral. And second step is the synthetic fiat and synthetic assets, right? So that means we'll have euro and yen and all these. We'll have all the different fiat tokens. And all of those are ultimately backed by the USD, which is then backed by DAI pegged to the USD, which is then backed by the diversified collateral portfolio. And the thing is, there's a massive advantage to have all the synthetic fiats backed specifically by USD. And that is because that's how Forex currently works, right? All currency transactions currently go through the US dollar, or most anyway go through it, and especially in terms of Forex trading and hedging, most of all, right? So, and the hedging part is what's really crucial, because it's basically because the best pairs to hedge is something let's say the dollar against euro is one of the most liquid markets in existence, and it's incredibly efficient and incredibly cheap to, for instance, go long euro against dollar or short euro against dollar. And that means that when you use dollar-pegged DAI as collateral for generating euro stablecoins. Your exposure, that's kind of like using Maker to short euro against the dollar. And if you're a market maker and you want to do that, then you can hedge your exposure to this forex exposure by then going to a traditional forex broker and then just like doing the opposite trade there, right? So then going long euro against dollar. And this will be extremely cheap and extremely efficient. So you'll be able to like provide very tight spreads when you're market making and making the euro stablecoin available. And that's actually one of the main downsides to switching to a diversified basket, is that it's still possible to hedge with a diversified basket, but it's just more expensive and more difficult because there's not this like standardized markets for whatever, for the diversified basket. So what that really means is that the ecosystem must be a lot more mature before we can really do this. And it means that also it's kind of like, it's super crucial that when we switch to the diversified basket, we must actually provide very solid evidence that we're not shooting ourselves in the foot for the sake of, like looking cool or like, getting rid of the US dollar or something like that, right? But then, inadvertently actually decreasing efficiency of the system as a whole.
Just to be clear, are we talking about a basket of goods or a basket of currencies?
Well, so that's the other thing. And then that's back to the whole iterative thing. So definitely, it's iterative in terms of where we want to go in the long run. And actually, what's really cool is that in the very long run, it's actually my belief that at some point we don't even the very long run endpoint is actually just one DAI is worth one DAI. It's that we don't even really it's a complicated topic, but it's basically a matter of whether we are doing a monetary policy based on external considerations. So based on, we want to, everything is focused on making it easy to go from DAI to dollar or DAI to other currencies. And so that's sort of like the world we have. Or at some point, maybe actually the internal economy of people just using entirely DAI and pricing all their loans in DAI and having all their goods priced in DAI and doing everything in DAI. If that actually becomes significant enough, then at some point our monetary policy will actually start to focus on that aspect, and basically will work is essentially in the way that central banks think about their economies in big countries. At which point the interest, the exchange rate to other currencies actually becomes this secondary matter, basically, and it's not the thing that is actually trying to be targeted. So at that point, that creates sort of a truly free-floating external exchange rate, right? Because we're just not trying to target a particular exchange rate. We're trying to target, let's say, a particular internal inflation rate in the internal DAI economy, for instance. But anyway, so that's the extreme long run, right? That could be 50 years or 100 years in the future or something. For the very short runs, literally the first step, it's definitely going to be a basket of currencies. That's the only thing that makes sense for the very short run. And I think actually, because our main consideration is this whole thing about how we want to have a stable coin of every local currency, and we kind of believe that that's what people want. They want their own currency. They don't really want something new, right? And blockchain, or sort of the adoption of blockchain is entirely based on being able to give people stuff that's familiar. So it's sort of right. So it's crucial to be able to deliver people their local their local currency is a stable coin seamlessly, and that's where the US dollar is quite useful. But also, that's where we can use our basket approach actually to do some interesting stuff here. Because, for instance, we can look at the composition. Or we can look at the adoption of local currency, like synthetic fiat, right? So we could look at something. We can see maybe it turns out that Korean won DAI is actually the most popular, or maybe the second most popular type of stablecoin we're providing, or maybe it's Japanese yen, won, and US dollar, and basically no euro, for instance, right? And if that's what we're observing, then we can use that data to create a basket that becomes the optimal basket for generating those three types of currencies as synthetic fiat.
Yeah, that's all fascinating. To give us, I know it's not great to pin you down to timelines, but if you had to guess these additional currencies, would you place that 2 years out, 1 year out, 5 years out?
Yeah, I would think I mean, I'm pretty confident we can have synthetic fiat next year, because it is actually a very, like, in my opinion, that is like very much a version 1 type thing, where it's not really like a stable coin isn't really serious until it's in your local currency, right? Like if you're, just whatever, from whatever country that isn't America, it's not really like, it's not that cool if, well, great, you can make the US dollar, but not my, that still means it still creates the same effect as, I mean, it's not as severe as now you have to think in Bitcoins, right? Mm-hmm. But it's still kind of the same where, you want to use some cool new blockchain tech. Well, first you have to deal with the fact that you got to use some strange foreign currency, right? And of course the US dollar is, like, of all the foreign currencies, the US dollar is the best, but it's still a foreign currency to most people. So yeah, that is like, it's not going to be available at launch, right? But it's going to be like the fast follower.
All right, that's cool. We sort of went down a rabbit hole here. It was an interesting one, but I'd like to stay on the foundation proposal if possible. I think that we've kind of covered sustainable finance a bit, but I'd like to talk about gradual decentralization a bit more. Can you give us a brief minute or two recap, Rune?
Yeah, I mean, so gradual decentralization really is a commitment to the fact that Maker in the long run should be an actual decentralized autonomous organization, right? Which means it should be completely, well, first of all, it should be it's like what Maker is very well defined and very specific, right? It's a smart contract infrastructure, and it's a community that interacts with that smart contract infrastructure. And it's not a company, is sort of the most important thing, right? It's not like a stock or an organization or anything like that, right? And we are very, and one of the things that means is, for instance, there's not going to be like a board of directors or a CEO or something, right? Like some sort of like leadership that everyone places, that, and where the governance becomes choosing the leadership and then sort of having faith that they'll run it, and then potentially, like applying like a fiduciary duty on them or something like that, right? And having that type of relationship. So that's what we absolutely don't want to happen, right? Because then we are really not it's not really that innovative, because it's basically just a bank in that case, like something very similar to a bank. Rather, what we really want to create is something that's super bare bones, and where the bulk of the work and sort of all the effort being created to maintain and sort of steer the project in the long run comes directly from the MK holders and from the community. So there's no layer between the community and the core of the system. Well, I mean, of course, there's still like different roles for different people in the community, for instance, but it's kind of like the point is that it should be there's still like this direct relationship between the community and the specific roles in the community, and then the core smart contracts should be sort of there should be as little possible else. So what that means most crucially is that the community needs to be able to just like control and run Maker competently on their own, right? And not just like run it in good times, but actually also be able to deal with black swan events and that kind of stuff, and sort of deal with which is the hard part of running a system, and also control in such a way that it grows properly, and that it maintains its like image and brand and so on, and it's sort of so it's on track to global adoption and all that kind of stuff.
How do you foresee the architecture of that working though? Is the primary mechanism through voting and individual Maker holders having their say on specific proposals, or is it? Do you envision an ecosystem of sort of highly engaged groups of stakeholders sort of picking up various aspects of the organization and sort of running with it. So like distributed risk teams or distributed business development teams, or maybe a large fund decides to devote some internal resources towards R&D. Is that the kind of thing that you're looking at or imagining?
Yeah, I mean, so I think R&D, like the future development of the system, I think is like an interesting point, because that is actually something I think should be properly funded by the community in the long run. Because it's one of those things where we can't really, like, we must ensure that there's some level of funds going to continuously, for instance, just like auditing the system, right? Ensuring it's secure in the long run. It's possible that that's actually all we'll need, and there won't really be needed, like upgrades and that kind of stuff will actually be unnecessary if we're able to like create a properly long-run scalable system, which maybe maybe the first try won't be successful in that, and like in the very far future there will need to be another version that's sort of actually set up for being permanent. But the other thing, like something like business development, for instance, in the long run, like, I mean, it's again, like, there has to be, like, the community probably will see an advantage from ensuring that there's some just fundamental level of, like, sort of official, like just a support in some way, right? Which could be whatever, just like, I think actually the most crucial thing is in terms of like business development, sort of like in terms of helping companies on board, is actually legal and regulatory input, rather than the more like bread and butter stuff of just like developing products that integrate DAI and then like selling them to customers, because that's something that can very easily be monetized. And definitely the goal is, you know, that it should not be that like the Maker community and Maker itself is like responsible for getting companies all over the world to adopt DAI, right? It should be like just regular software consultancies that basically, or blockchain consultancies, that in the same way that they, like, when they recommend some blockchain to a customer and they're like, well, you should use Ethereum because that's the most widely adopted and it has various scalability solutions and has support and blah, blah, blah. The same should apply to Maker, right? Like, it should be, DAI is this like useful tool that we use whenever we need a stable coin because it's the best and everyone else uses it. And that's kind of like, that's one of the things that's really cool about a blockchain-based system, right? Is that it can be optimized for this kind of stuff. So rather than spending a ton of money on marketing and sort of sales in the long run, we can rather just like make the best possible deal, right? Like the lowest possible fee, the lowest possible fees in the system, right? And like the best liquidity and high stability and that kind of stuff. So it just becomes like the strongest thing to use, so people sort of organically choose to adopt it. But the way things, like all of this stuff should be governed is basically like, and this is what I think is a crucial part, right? Is that it should be governed in like this very, very open and sort of very broad consensus-seeking process, right? So ultimately, that's kind of going to be like it's going to be an inefficient and not very flexible way to, like, it's not, you know, it's not how you can't really run a business like that. But then the thing is that we don't really want to, like, it's kind of an important thing is we don't want to run a business, right? We want to like maintain an infrastructure. And
so the primary focus is to create the ecosystem, but do it over time in a way that doesn't put the DAO in jeopardy or create instability.
Yeah, I mean, so now we're talking about like what decentralization looks like in the long run, right? But the next question is then like, how do we get there from what we are today, which is like a completely different situation, right?
Well, it's interesting. I think that Kenny Rowe is going to ask you that question right now. Actually, Kenny, do you want to jump in and ask?
Sure. So the question I wanted to kind of propose to you, Rune, is what kind of feedback loops are being considered in the context of decentralized governance?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a very, that's a very good and sort of useful way to consider governance in general, right? Like decentralization in general. And I think, I mean, the most basic feedback loop is just the MKR price, right? And sort of that really basic relationship that most people typically get, right? Which is if a governance screws up, then everybody loses money because they voted with MKR, meaning they hold MKR, and something bad happened and they have to bail it out with their MKR. So it's this like natural incentive and basically direct cost. But I think, I mean, in the concept of like in terms of what we're trying to set up today that we want to actually last and sort of hopefully make sure that the long run governance it becomes a way that actually makes sense and works and doesn't sort of stray down a path that's unsustainable, just fundamentally can't work and ultimately breaks apart because of that. That's actually where that's where my favorite thing, the 20% principle, right? Like the charity becomes relevant, because I think basically that is the fundamental sort of what I basically like to call like community spirit or abundance mentality, this kind of stuff like that. That's what I think is really important to seed now, and then get to a point where it actually can just like sustain itself. So where like just like we see positive benefits, and we're sort of just like the mentality permeates the community and the DAO to the point where it just like it becomes the natural status quo, and it sort of naturally spreads itself, and then it gives us this benefit, like all these various benefits, such as the filtering effect, where we sort of naturally become undesirable to like short-term sort of selfish profit seekers and that kind of stuff, who just will just be less attracted to this kind of system, or this kind of like, because they will believe that it's not possible, which is really good, because they will also be the same kinds of people who would sort of believe that others in governance would be voting like doing sort of the selfish vote, where they use the power of governance to benefit themselves rather than to to try to actually achieve scientific consensus and like try to actually reach the goals of the system in terms of long run stability and sustainability.
Cool. Kenny, do you think that answer your question, or do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I think the MKR price is definitely a feedback, and then that's maybe also an example of one that requires low coordination between different members, because they can sort of independently see those. There are also different other kinds of feedbacks that require high levels of coordination, like showing up at a meeting, or committee processes, or any number of different ways that we've already kind of used in society in general. But the question was a little bit more towards, is Maker considering new forms of things, like using markets as governance, or prediction markets, or liquid democracy, newish types of things? Or is it, we're going to try some of the things that have sort of already been true or been worked in sort of previous generations, but using new tools to make them more efficient?
Yeah, so that's a good topic, right? So basically, the answer is that we want to use everything, right? So we want to utilize sort of all traditional knowledge on the topic, and sort of also recognize that basically there's no silver bullet, right? It's not possible to just like make perfect governance. There's always problems and inefficiencies with it. So at the same time, we also want to experiment with everything new, but again, not try to like sort of naively rely on any one method. For instance, what's it called? The future key stuff, right? Like prediction market based governance is like very hyped and like very exciting for technologists typically, but there's like fundamental issues with it that really makes it a lot more like traditional, like that really introduces sort of all the traditional governance problems that you have anyway to it, like such as manipulation, for instance, right? And like cryptoeconomic incentives and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think that these are a lot of these issues are what we've been discussing specifically in our Thursday meetings about scientific governance and the risk framework, where we touch on delegation, voter apathy, what the actual mechanics of the future voting is going to look like, Kenny, if you're interested in that kind of thing, we'd love to see you tomorrow as well. You have the time.
Right. Absolutely. Thanks.
Cool.
Yeah, and I just think a good point. Sorry, just like an important point to that the whole thing about using all these different tools for governance is that ultimately, like, if you want to like and that is sort of our core philosophy is, right, if you want to use some particular tool, well, we want to use all tools, but the most important thing for us is we want to be able to evaluate whether it's actually producing something useful or whether it's outputting stuff that doesn't make any sense. And in order for us to be able to make that evaluation, we have to actually, I guess you can say, sort of endogenously, right? Like on our own, kind of, right? Like from ourselves, figure out what is the right way to do stuff, right? Like what is the right way to set risk parameters? And once we have an idea of what we think are the right way to set risk parameters, then we can safely use something like prediction markets to help us get an extra perspective. Because we don't take the risk then that actually, oh shit, the prediction markets turn out to be super manipulated or it's like totally wrong and something terrible happens because we're a little bit too naive, right? So that is why ultimately, like, the core philosophy of the governance process is something like there's no shortcuts, right? You have to actually like do the hard work of doing like a full risk assessment and based on like all first principles and really is like coming up with the numbers in sort of by thinking about it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that we all have this very clear understanding that governance is not a solved problem yet, and that it needs to be addressed patiently and cautiously, I think, over time. And I think that's why gradual decentralization is a term that we keep on coming back to over and over again, I think. Rune, there's two questions from the community. One of them is kind of a hardball, but I'm gonna throw it your way anyways. Under the heading of gradual decentralization, the question is, how do you envision large corporate stakeholders will react to fully decentralized governance? Do you think there's going to be some reluctance there, or is this a positive for them?
I think that's, well, actually that's really hard to, I have no idea, but I would say everyone thinks, like, for something like DAI and Maker, I think everyone will consider it a positive because it creates, like, because DAI is all about stability, and because we can actually, like, potentially create a governance system and sort of there's like an entire system that is fully transparent, right? Because that's sort of one of the side effects of decentralized governance is that there's no such thing as insiders, and no such thing as like a team or trusted, central party or something like that, right? So that means there's no black box, right? There's no insider knowledge, or rather outsiders are the insiders in a sense, right? Like everyone has the full knowledge. And that's just, if you're a big corporate company and you want to use some new financial tool, probably one of the main things that you're really happy about is if you can actually just like, if you can, it's like about like how stable or how like reliable this thing gonna be. And if you know that you have full access to all information, that's gonna be something that, really makes you feel better, right? Like it's just like an obvious plus to a stablecoin.
Yeah, so the sort of radical transparency that the DAO offers, but also larger stakeholders have the opportunity to engage with the decision-making process through governance as well. So it's got to be a net win for them, I assume.
Yeah.
Right.
Sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Jessica.
Or no, you can go on. Rune, I was going to bring up a question.
So I just want to say that I think, like, to some degree, that type of like stakeholder engagement to monetary policy and like risk assessment and so on, it does sort of exist in the current financial system, right? But it's just not really something that's like there's no like, it's not like something that is promoted, I guess you can say, right, or like encouraged. But anyone can, for instance, like participate in the scientific discussion on monetary policy, for instance, right? It is a scientific field, right? And also, you can vote, governments set the, set the financial rules and change the laws and so on. So there's like those types of engagement already exists, right? And it is how we've been able to to survive so far, like how finance has been able to work so far, is because actually there has been this like anti-fragile crowdsourced process of slowly figuring out how can you let, like what can you do financially and what's too risky. And so what we want to do is just, we want to take this to the extreme and just create this like the perfect, or like the best possible conditions for just continuous iteration on financial governance over time.
Right. So Jordan actually asked, what kind of timeline do you see for MKR holders voting directly on the use of funds and development fund and paying like MakerDAO employees, for example, et cetera?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, right? So what's really interesting here is actually that this will be available already at Multi-Collateral DAI launch, and it's a feature that hasn't really been talked much about yet, but it's called Suck. It's named like that because, yeah, it's like a meme. It's from our developers who sort of want, you know, so when they coded this, they sort of knew that this is a very dangerous, like very, you know, potentially dangerous thing to do, because taking money from the system, right, like from the fees, is just like, it's kind. I mean, it's just like it's you know, it's like it's something potentially being very controversial. It's kind of akin to something like inflating the supply of a coin or something like that, right? So it's kind of like you know, like it's like the majority of the community deciding for the entirety of the community to do something with the money, and there's potential for abuse here and all these like considerations. So, but anyways, the point is just, that's why it's called Suck, because it's like something that needs to be taken very seriously. It's like a very powerful tool that also can be very risky to use, but ultimately that will be in Multi-Collateral DAI and will allow, and will, I mean, and the moment that exists, that's basically when the community becomes like, well, I mean, theoretically, or at least technically, that's when the community becomes the real foundation in a sense, right? Because that's the point where the community can decide to fund whatever it wants, can do anything it wants, right? It can just, like, as long as there's income in the system, parts of that income can be reinvested and used in various things. So this doesn't actually directly answer the question, because the question's about the use of funds in a development fund, right? But the answer is that will never happen. Like, there will never be, well, or rather, the answer is that is, for instance, the foundation proposal and that kind of stuff, right? But like, the whole point of having a development fund and having these sort of pre-allocated MKR is that this is the stuff that needs to be used in a very flexible manner to do, like, you know, high growth development in the short term, right? And sort of actually act a bit like a company, right, that's competing in a marketplace. Whereas using Suck is going to be something that's going to be like highly bureaucratic, is maybe the wrong word, because it's kind of the opposite. Like, it's kind of like very transparent and like direct. But rather, like, there'll be a lot of inertia, right? And it will be very political in a sense, like that there's going to be a lot of caution around what do we want to see funded with Suck. And the most important stuff that initially the community will have to look at is stuff like paying for oracles, paying for the global settlement infrastructure, and paying for risk assessment and communications, also like governance-related communications, but also like just like global necessary system communication, like community building and community communications, basically.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it's something we should probably swing back to at our next meeting. We have 8 minutes left, and we promised to talk a bit about the recent conversations about the 20% principle. David, did you pick out some questions for us for Rune to address?
Yeah, I mean, I summarized most of the objections into 4 points. I realized that a lot of the objections that were kind of like really easy to counter. But the 4 ones that I thought were the most interesting were, number 1, people seem to get tripped up over the word charity, and the fact that there's not a lot of clarity surrounding what initiatives we're going to give to. And in the thread, I responded by, listing, my examples from the article and asking them to see, to point out which ones are the most contentious. But I think that makers should probably come out with some document listing like the contentiousness, or like how politically divisive some initiatives are versus others, and then categorically exclude the ones that are like not politically polarizing or contentious. That was my idea there. Then the second thing is the broken focus argument, where people say, oh, why is Maker focusing on charity when they should be focusing on development? That's what they're good at. And, that's also answered by the fact that Maker is not 10 people, it's like 70 people. And, there's people that can be hired to focus on that. So it doesn't take away from the technical talent of the team or the technical ability to complete the roadmap and et cetera, et cetera. That's how I answered that. Then there's the fractured community argument, where there was concerns about the fact that there is a portion of people that are against the 20% principle, and that a fraction of the community might be bad for our ecosystem. And then the last one, which is actually something that Milner brought up to me, he asked me, how can we justify as like a capitalistic system that is for profit, how can we justify instead of taking this 200K MKR and aggressively funding even more like development or like specifically DAI adoption, why make it a charity rather than fuel more aggressively the growth of the company? And it's like cost benefit, right? If you have a cost giving away charity, then you're losing the benefit of spending that money on more development, or spending that money on more advertising, or spending more money on something else. So those were like the four main things that had some credibility to them, but the rest of the arguments were mostly just shifting goalposts and just misunderstandings and things of that nature. There was a lot of like negative comments on that.
Yeah, so I think the sort of the political contentiousness of charity and sort of like saying charity is politics. It's basically, it's like, well, so my answer to that, right, was also something like, well, financing is also the same thing, right? Like there's like, you can't politicize finance and it happens all the time. And like you're saying, David, it's basically a matter of, of course, the point is that the kind of charity that should be funded with the 20% principle is not supposed to be something, like it's not, it's kind of supposed to be like neutral stuff that makes sense, right? And it actually, initially we were considering just saying, this is not for charity, this is for basic income or something like that, right? This is really just about giving DAI to people. And potentially, and this is sort of one of the...
Just a second. In regards to that, sorry, I actually missed that. Direct giving schemes, the main problem was lack of infrastructure. So you can give people DAI, but if they have nowhere to spend it, or like in a sandbox for all the merchants and all the basic necessities except DAI, that would make sense. But to give DAI out to just people, like there was that issue as well.
Yeah, and that's actually what and that's kind of why that initially it doesn't make sense to say this is just going to be basic income and nothing else, right? Because initially there's like a whole bunch of stuff necessary before you can just start handing out DAI and sort of create this get adoption by giving people DAI effect, right? But I guess you can say it's I guess you can say our end goal is just sort of neutral, unbiased, universal basic income, as I see it anyway, right? That's what I think would be the most natural thing to use the 20% principle for in the long run. But then in the short run, and initially, there has to be done a lot of groundwork to sort of build up the necessary infrastructure for that stuff to make sense. And that's where I think in particular focusing on specific regions is what's going to have a lot of cost benefit, like very high cost benefit impact, because we can sort of find these areas where, let's say we initially what we do is we hand out smartphones, and then we set up all the local shops, or like the merchants with smartphones, and they build and like sort of access to converting DAI into other forms of local currency. And then once we have that in place, then we can start handing out basic income to the people. And then actually and then the goal would be, we want to create this like closed, or rather like self-sustainable economy where these people just switch over to using DAI because it's just like, it's what they already have because they're constantly getting it from the charity scheme, and it's just better than what they were using before. So it just seems so natural for them, right? And like, I think what really makes sense is basically creating a number of these hubs and like find like the sort of the unbanked hotspots where there's both like low levels of financial infrastructure, but also high potential for actual growth if there's just some catalyst that can get in there and actually help people just get like the initial escape velocity they need for things to go on a positive growth track. And that's the kind of stuff I think is really like, there's nothing, I mean, this kind of stuff, right? It's just like because these considerations ultimately will be based on not something like, not political thought, like not political stuff, like, who do we want to help, or, what, how do we define making the world a better place and so on. Actually, what we are thinking about here is just how do we maximize DAI adoption, right? Like, how do we use like what kind of infrastructure we have to build, and then what kind of strategy do we have to use in terms of handing out DAI to ultimately get the best sort of long run usage and retention of these users.
I think that Jordan raised another interesting point. Jess, did you want to see if there's a...
Yeah, Jordan points out that he personally would like to see a separation between the development team and the people that are then implementing the 20% funds.
So I think that's interesting because there's a separation of church and state a bit, I think he's proposing there, but also it ties into the fact that these proposals will be sort of scientifically defined. Did you want to comment on that, Rune?
Yeah, I mean, so first I just want to, so I mean, unfortunately I couldn't get to all these points by David, but I think the one about like the fractured community is actually the most serious of the points. And basically, I think one of the consequences of that, I mean, which, because it makes perfect sense, right, is that, if the foundation proposal gets a very, like, if there is significant resistance to it in the end and in the vote, I'm not sure it can be justified to actually say, let's implement the 20% principle if we end up like with sort of a tight race, right, where it's like 51% vote yes and 49% vote no, right? I mean, then that would be, that could actually cause, just like people are saying, right, that could cause some serious damage to the community, where there's just like people who basically feel like, oh, okay, so even though we are almost half of the entire community, we actually, we were, like, we were sort of the victims of majority tyranny or whatever it's called. So I think that's like something to take very seriously, right? And I actually am a little like, ultimately, I think the main concerns of people are not really like, I think they're, it's a lot of it is like trust based. It's kind of that it's like, I mean, it's like kind of, they just have this natural reaction. Oh, oh no, this tech project, everything is going well, and now suddenly they're going nuts about like, charity and whatever. And it's kind of like they see it as sort of like a sign of just like us losing our minds, basically, rather than being this like something that is actually, something we attempt to like, like it's based on sort of rational thought, right? And like, it's just like, it's sort of creating an actual benefit. But anyway, so let me just get to this last comment, right? There should be a separation between the dev team, so the foundation, and the 20% funds. And that is absolutely, I mean, that's exactly the point, right? I mean, the point is, in fact, also the 20% principal funds, the 20% funds, right, would, the point where that would be that these would be given into the hands of the community immediately, right? It would be a way to create a lot of substance for the governance community to sort of attack early on, right? Where like the actual risk assessment and the like the governance process initially will be very focused around like the few experts who right now both are like blockchain experts and financial experts, right? And actually are able to properly wrap their heads around how to do this, how to do like risk assessment and setting risk parameters for CDPs. Whereas the question of like charity and sort of the things that need to be considered there are actually more like, it's more something that a broader, like a broader group of the community can participate in, because, well, it's just like more like, it's basically because it's low hanging fruit in a sense, right? Because I mean, we're not trying to like, you know, like do better than current finance. Rather, we're trying to like, you know, we're just like looking for people in need of help, or like looking for places where it makes sense to hand out DAI, and then executing on that. And that's kind of something where, you know, like it's less about like being an expert and, you know, dealing with a hard question, and more about like manpower basically, and like doing a lot of like research and looking over a lot of different places and sort of potential initiatives we can back and all that kind of stuff. But
Sure,
yeah,
I think it's worth reinforcing though that it's the charitable recipients won't be dictated by the development team. It's a part of the governance process. The proposals will be written by potentially the risk teams or outside experts in the humanitarian agencies could write their own proposals. It'll be a community effort to determine who the recipients could possibly be. Is that correct? Rune?
Yeah. And I think, I mean, we did say that initially we want to, we kind of wanted to make sure that things actually work well initially. So the idea is that at first it would be the foundation sort of leading the process and basically creating the first proposals, but that would entirely be so that the community isn't just left like with no idea what to do, right? And rather the foundation would sort of guide the process along initially, and then as quickly as possible, with the gradual decentralization principle. But for charity in particular, it would be more like swift decentralization in a sense, right? As quickly as possible, basically try to turn this into something self-sustainable that the community just handles on its own.
Okay, great. We're 5 minutes after the hour, so we're going to have to wrap it up for today. Thanks everyone for your questions; those were amazing. Thanks, Rune, for doing this again, and Jess. Thanks. We'll be posting this to YouTube in about an hour if people want to view. And if you have any additional questions you like asked for the next meeting that we didn't get to today, please add it to the thread that will be linked at the bottom of the video. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, you guys.
See you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.